Happy Sunday, everyone. As the father of one teenager and soon to be another, and as a former somewhat rebellious teenager myself, I've been thinking a lot recently about how we are helping young people in the church gain and retain and apply a testimony. I'm in our ward's young men's, leadership or whatever you want to call it. I was actually thinking the other day about Trek. I'm probably going to do a whole musing about Trek and these like synthesized spiritual experiences that we try and manufacture for kids, which I consider a bit problematic. But that's a topic for another day. Today, I want to pose the question and have a discussion around, is the church losing the youth? What are the demographics like for the church in the future? And what's happening today with youth in terms of, retaining them as active members of the church? One of the things that I found that I'm going to say is tangentially related to this is some polling data that this guy on Twitter I was reading through the other day, Ryan Berg, and he was creating all these charts showing the political composition of different faiths, different religions over time. So from like 2008 to 2022. And so he's kind of plotting the progress based on all this polling data to see how members of different religions are changing over time in their political views. And you might say, well, what does this have to do with youth staying in the church? And, it's my belief that our political views are an outward manifestation of our most closely held beliefs, that we don't have a political bucket and a religious bucket or whatever. And so some of these changes that we see through people's political alignment and their affiliations is an indication for some more fundamental opinion and belief changes that are happening. So we'll step through this a little bit to see what I mean. Now, in one of the graphs that this guy produced, he was focused on millennials, so 18 to 35 years of age, and showing all these different religions. And he started by focusing on, Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And by no means am I going to equate the Republican Party with, righteous Latter-day Saints, and the Democrat Party is implicitly, opposed and so forth. The history of Utah is quite fascinating in the sense that when it was a territory, there was independent political parties, and the church basically, when they wanted statehood, dissolved the local political parties and split the membership up halvesies into joining both the leading two political parties, in large measure because they desired to win friends amongst all of the leadership so that they could secure statehood. So partisanship or your affiliation with a political party in no way implies, some kind of spiritual gotcha. There's plenty of Republicans, I would argue, are completely inconsistent in their actions and decisions with the tenets of the gospel. But it's interesting nonetheless. So we'll start with the partisan side, and then we'll get into the ideological side, the actual kind of affiliation with a particular philosophy, you might say. What's fascinating to me is looking at this year span from 2008 to 2022, Mormons were the only ones that had what I'll call a remarkable decline in affiliation with Republicans and a corresponding increase in affiliation with Democrats. Because you might say, oh, lots of people, because of Donald Trump or whatever, right? They're leaving the Republican Party and they're just, becoming independent and so forth. And yet, the polling data shows a remarkable increase in support in affiliation with the Democrat Party amongst Mormons at this younger age bracket, 18 to 35. We're not talking broad church membership. We're just focusing on the young people. So when you look at evangelicals and like Black Protestants, for example, during the same time period, their affiliation with the Democrats dropped by double what Mormons dropped on the Republican side. So black Protestants over this time span are increasingly leaving the Democrat Party, and they're affiliating both with Republicans and independents. Both of those rise up. But you can look at, Catholics. Catholics are flat the entire time. Really no remarkable change or change of note at all in their affiliation over time. You look at Jews, there's a slight uptick recently in affiliation with the Democrats, but fairly consistent over the years. Muslims, much like black Protestants, also had a big decline in their affiliation with the Democrat Party. But overall, things are fairly consistent with all these religious groups. And yet for the Mormons, we see a consistent decline in affiliation with Republicans and a corresponding incline or increase in affiliation with the Democrats. Okay, so moving past partisanship, because ultimately who cares about political parties? They're just institutions. They don't necessarily mean much of anything by way of understanding what someone believes. So then the data goes based on ideology. And unfortunately, they, as most polls, give you very narrow options that for folks like me, I never feel like I can quite answer the question, because they say conservative, liberal, or moderate. Right. And so those were the choices in all of these different polls. Again, they were mapped over all these 2008 to 2022. And once again, you see, a remarkable decline in affiliation for Mormons, young Mormons, with conservatism. There is recently in the past couple of years, a little bit of an uptick, actually, for conservatives. But for the past, what has this been, decade, there's been a steady decline away from conservatism and a corresponding increase in support for liberalism, which I hate, because a true liberal is someone who believes in liberty. The founding fathers, most of them, many of them were what we would call classical liberals today. So today's liberals are more progressives and statists and socialists. They're not really true liberals, but this is the parlance that people use. It's what we say liberal. People understand what that means. And so similarly, you look at all these other religions, white evangelicals, for example, very consistent across the board for conservatism, for liberalism, for being a moderate. You look at mainline Christians, same thing. Jews, fairly consistent as well. Atheists, pretty high up there for affiliation with being a liberal. Very few conservative atheists. So again, you see a lot of consistency in a lot of these other religions, and yet for Mormons, for young Mormons, 18 to 35, what you see is a decline in conservatism and an increase in neoliberalism. And I think this is worthy of pointing out, not as a direct corollary to like, hey, look, young Mormons are abandoning conservatism and Republicans, therefore they're leaving the church. That's not the connection I'm going to make. What I am trying to point out is I think that there's a worldview change, a change in belief systems and views that have a spillover effect into what these young people believe about their faith. Again, not that all conservatives are inherently more in alignment with Christianity, and yet on the whole, especially on a lot of social topics, I do believe that so-called conservatism is generally more in alignment with the doctrines of the church. And so when you're espousing more quote-unquote liberal views, you're likely supporting, widespread abortion access and people's, women's right to so-called choose. You're supporting, gender war, trans, LGBT, all the things, gay marriage and so forth, right? Which has some inconsistencies with church doctrine and proclamation on the family and the rest. You're more likely to support socialism, which, as I've written in my books, is completely incompatible with the doctrines of Christ. You're more likely to support big government, coercing other people, being an authoritarian and not using persuasion. Again, that's not loving other people. It's institutionalizing quite the opposite. And so someone who is adopting more of this liberal, neo-modern liberal perspective, I believe, speaking generally, is increasingly incompatible with the basic faith tenets, doctrines of the church. And so the increase in young Mormons who are identifying with these worldviews, I think is a, not causation, but I think it is a correlation to the fact that so many of these young people are losing their testimonies, going inactive, and leaving the church. So, for example, before we step away from the polling and we talk about some other aspects here, look at, for example, 60-year-old Latter-day Saints. So maybe that's your dad, your grandpa, 60-year-old Latter-day Saints. 70% of them say that they're Republicans and 20% say that they're Democrats. So the GOP beat the Dems by like a 3.5 to 1 margin, okay, for this age group, for the older generation of Mormons. Then go down a generation to the 40-year-olds. Okay, I'm 40, so this is me. Am I 40? I'm 41. I don't even remember. I'm 41 now. Okay, among 40-year-olds, 60% are Republicans, so down from 70% for the 60-year-olds. So now 60% of Mormons my age are Republicans, and almost 30% are Democrats. So that's a 2 to 1 gap, down from a 3.5 to 1 gap. Now it's a 2 to 1 gap. So then go to the college age Mormons, these younger demographic, the young adults that we're talking about. Barely over half of them now align with the Republican Party. 35% of them are Democrats. That's only a 15-point gap. Whereas for 60-year-olds, it was a 50-point gap. What's also fascinating to me about this data is that it's not necessarily representative of what's going on. Because this polling data, remarkable though it is and interesting though it is to kind of see these trends, this polling data only focuses on people who still see themselves as a Latter-day Saint. So these are people who are still identifying as Mormon who are having these shifts. But there's a lot of people who were formerly Mormon, right? Or maybe still technically members of the church, but they no longer, identify with that faith community, who have totally gone in an opposite direction and have changed their worldviews and their perceptions. That's just not showing up in the polling data. The polling data is only an indication of how people are responding with their current religious identity. In other words, I think it's even worse than this polling data suggests in showing this trend. Again, not that, oh, it's horrible, they're no longer Republicans. Like, that's not what I'm implying or saying here. But again, it is a shift in worldview and a shift in beliefs that ultimately I believe is inconsistent with many doctrines of our faith. And so, you see, I did a whole musing on abortion and talked there about how young Mormons are increasingly supporting abortion. And you get all these TikTok Mormon moms and whatever who are, blabbering on about the latest, neoliberal talking points, and they're indistinguishable from, the rest of the kind of wokish, whatever, young people that you see coming out of college campuses. And these people are not at all being informed by their faith. They are very much kind of, what does it say is it in 1 Peter, where everyone says being buffeted about by every wind of doctrine? These people are, they have no anchor, they have no rudder. They're just being blown around by the winds of political and societal change. And they just also happen to be Mormon by identity and background, but they have not really wrestled with the incompatibility of their political worldview, along with the supposed beliefs that they hold on the religious side. Now, what's interesting to me, getting to these young Mormon adults, is that looking across 3 different national polls that have been done within recent years, roughly 60% of these young adults who were raised in the church continue to keep an identity of Mormonism, you might say, continue to affiliate with the Mormon church as adults. 60%. Only 60% of young adults will continue in their older years as they mature, continue to identify with church. While interesting, that polling data is also limited and not fully accurate because it is not pointing out church activity, right? You can get some of these people who will continue in a poll when they're asked to be like, oh yeah, I'm, Mormon, but they haven't been in 18 years and they don't really believe it anymore or whatever. So again, it's not fully capturing what's going on here. This is just people who on a survey, when given an option of all these different religions, tick the box for LDS or Mormon. Now, I should point out that compared to other religions, that 60% figure that we're only keeping 60% of of young adults as they become full-on adults, that data is not horrible compared to other religions. We're having just in our society an increasing secularization of everything, right? And people are fleeing churches left and right, and it's not just our own. So this particular aspect is not necessarily a feature of Mormonism or a challenge for our church necessarily. It is a challenge for all churches in the highly secular modern environment that we are in. Now, in 2008, there was a, what was it called, like Mormon Leaks or whatever. There was some leaked videos that came out of from the church. And one of them was a meeting with a lot of the brethren, the leaders of the church, where they were discussing this particular topic. And they were reviewing some of their internal data, which, is typically not privy to the public. We get general membership data and so forth, right? But there's a lot of nuance there because membership does not necessarily, or not at all, imply activity and faithfulness and anything, right? Just like who has not revoked their membership. So according to this leaked data and the insights shared from the brethren of the church's own data showed that young single adults in our church have an activity rate, not a membership rate, not an affiliation on a poll rate, but an actual activity rate of 30% in the United States. So 60% are willing on a poll to continue to say that they're Mormon, but only 30% of them, according to the church's own data, are remaining active. And that's in the United States. Internationally, it's 20% of young single adults who will remain active in their older years. Okay, so how do we reconcile this with what Elder Quentin Cook said in 2015? In General Conference, he said this: "Some have asserted that more members are leaving the church today and that there is more doubt and unbelief than in the past. This is simply not true. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has never been stronger. The number of members removing their names from the records of the church has always been very small and is significantly less in recent years than in the past." So how do we reconcile that leaked video and the discussion using the church's internal data showing a 30% U.S. Retention and activity rate for young adults? How do we reconcile that with Elder Cook here saying that that's not true, that, more members are leaving today, that the church has never been stronger, that, the number of members removing their names has always been very small? Well, as I reflect on what Elder Cook is saying, I get the vibe of like the State of the Union address, right? No matter what crisis is happening, no matter how much corruption there is and how horrible things are going, whoever the president is, they'll get up there on that podium and they'll say, "The State of the Union is strong," right? Or you get these governors who do similar speeches, right? "The state of the state is strong." And they will always try to publicly present, fashion a narrative of strength and power, so as to not have to reveal and discuss, the internal problems. So as I read Elder Cook's quote, I get that kind of vibe that he's saying, "Some have asserted more members are leaving the church today. This is simply not true. The church has never been stronger." Let's pause there. What does he mean by that? To me, this is a totally definitional distinction. He might be saying that the church has never been stronger in terms of the number of missionaries serving, or the number of tithe payers, or the number of temples being built, or the number of people paying a fast offering, right? So it depends entirely upon what metrics he's using to say the church has never been stronger. And I probably wouldn't disagree at all if he were to kind of explain what particular metrics he's pointing to make the case that the church has never been stronger. So you could say, looking at these other metrics, "Oh yeah, wow, the number of missionaries has gone up in the past couple years. Great," right? But a lot of other metrics are flat or down. So this really becomes a question of how do you define that the church is stronger? And he didn't reveal which metrics he was using. Therefore, he can just be picking some of the ones where there has been some improvement, and the total number of, missionaries, for example. So you can look at that and say, oh, the youth of the church are, never been stronger. Well, that's just one little kind of tip of the iceberg statistic that benefits our narrative of strength, but it doesn't really, show what's happening in so many of the other people who aren't going on missions and so forth. So I'll quibble with that, where he says the church has never been stronger. It totally depends on your definitions, your metrics. And then he also says the number of members removing their names from the records of the church has always been very small and is significantly less in recent years than in the past. Well, to me, that's inconsequential to what we're discussing here, because we're not discussing membership numbers. We're discussing activity and faith and belief and people who are actually like in the church and not just, I went to church when I was 9 and it's been 40 years and I've never cared to, go remove my name from the church, because that's a barrier to entry. Last I looked into it when I was talking with someone a few years ago, apparently you have to get it like notarized or something. I don't know. So it's not go on to your LDS.org account and click a button to revoke your membership. So there are barriers in the way. And most people who leave the church are fine just ignoring it. They don't feel like they need to go through the motions of jumping through those hurdles. So for Elder Cook to say, oh, the number of people, that's not an indication of the church's strength, just because we have all these people on the church rolls who are completely inactive. For example, I do a lot of marketing, right? And we have a big email list. If I claim that everyone who's ever subscribed to my email list is an active subscriber, well, that's misleading. That's not really accurate. And it's not useful for me to really understand who the active people in my community are. There are tons of email addresses on my list who have never unsubscribed. They've never bothered to click the button, right? But they're ignoring the emails, or they're going to spam or whatever. And I can look and say, oh, wow, this person has not opened an email in a year and a half. Well, technically, they're on my email list. And like that person, there's thousands more, right? Tens of thousands, probably more, of people who just aren't getting the email. Maybe it's an old Yahoo email address that 7 years ago they were using when they first signed up, and they aren't checking it anymore. But it's inaccurate or misleading for me to say that my email list is this big and I have this many people, when really the strength of my email list and the reach and impact of it is the active subscribers who within the past, say, 3 to 6 months have opened an email, clicked on a link, read it, whatever, right? So I think similarly, we get these statistic reports in General Conference and look at the number of members of the church. Now I think we're at 17 million, I think we just passed. And yay, that's good. But if the activity rate of young adults is 30% in the United States and 20% for international young adults, I'm very curious what the activity rate of the older generation is. And even if it's high, this is our future. This is the future church that we are inheriting. And we're having this winnowing down of all of these young people who are just looking for the exits and deciding to leave. So I don't think the state of the union is strong. I don't think that we can claim that the church has never been stronger. In some cases, absolutely. There are some awesome metrics and progress to praise. But when by the church's own internal data, 70% of young people in the States are, no longer active, I think we need to have some serious discussions about why. And again, it's not just us. This is, tons of other churches and religions having this happen as well. So I found this article on leadingsaints.org from David Osler, and he was doing some of his own polling data trying to figure out the actual impact of what we're talking about, of young adults leaving the church. And using the polling data that I mentioned earlier and population numbers and all this stuff, he did some math, and he says, okay, there's about 14,000 congregations in the United States. This was as of 2014, so he was working with a little bit older data. 14,000 congregations. That translates based on, he said, okay, let me pause. In 2014, he says there were 360,000 more adults who are former LDS since 2007. So in a 7-year span, according to his extrapolations from the polling data, about 360,000 adults left the church. Now, this is based on polling data, which means that there's a margin of error, and this is not an exact number, right? But it's just useful to try and get an approximation. 360,000 adults who are former LDS. So then he says there's 14,000 congregations in the United States. That translates into 25 more former Latter-day Saint adults per congregation in the United States between 2007 and 2014. So a little less than a decade, 25 people on average, adults per ward, who are just deciding to stop going to church. He said in a stake of 8 wards, that means 200 adults no longer affiliate as LDS, enough for an entire ward. So then he did in his own stake, this guy David Osler, he did some polling to try and understand the perceptions between leaders and members when it comes to this kind of, young adult trend of leaving the church and faith crisis that a lot of them are having and so forth. And so first he said, do you have people in your circle that have had or are in a faith crisis? And then he kind of broke it down in different ways. So I'm just going to share a couple little data points. 26% said that they had a few immediate family members who had or were in a faith crisis. 26%. 32% said 1 or 2 people. Then if you take it out to extended family, 42% of people said that they had someone in their extended family going through or who had went through a faith crisis. And then close friends, 44% of respondents to this poll said that they had a few close friends. There was also an opportunity to say many. So 12% of people said that many of their immediate family members were having a faith crisis. 17% said many of their extended family were. 14% said many of their close friends were. And so people, consistent with what he was saying with that extrapolation before, 54% of people said that they knew a few people in their ward that were having a faith crisis. So pretty remarkable. So then he says, he asks a question of the leaders, and then he asks a question of the members. And he's trying to understand this question of faith crises and how prepared and helpful these people are. So first he asks the leaders, and he asks them to either agree or disagree with this statement. First statement: the church as a whole provides adequate information for leaders to help people who are in a faith crisis. Okay? And about 53% of leaders said that they agreed. The rest said they disagree. And there was an option for strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree. So 10% said that of leaders again, 10% of leaders said that they strongly agreed that the church had provided adequate information. 43% just said that they agree. 36% said that they disagree. These are leaders of the church. 10% said that they strongly disagree. So pretty remarkable. Then they were asked to comment on this statement: I feel that I can effectively help a person who is having a faith crisis. So all in all, about 54% of leaders, church leaders, said that they agreed. And the rest, 45%-ish, said that they disagreed. That's remarkable. Almost half of church leaders, again, that were polled in this particular stake, so it's not necessarily representative of the whole church, but I think it's likely indicative of broader sentiment, right? They felt that way about people in their own ward. And then they were asked about people in their own family, and the numbers were basically the same. So this isn't just a church leader thing. These are, as adult Mormon individuals, like, how capable do you feel? Whether someone in your ward or someone in your family, and many people said that they didn't feel that they could effectively help them. So then he was asking similar questions to members. So members of the church who are not in a leadership position. First statement: the church as a whole provides adequate information for leaders to help people who are in a faith crisis. 0.3% said that they strongly agreed. 0.0% said that they agreed. 21% said that they disagreed with that. 78.5% said that they strongly disagreed. that the church has provided adequate information for leaders to help people who are in a faith crisis. Wow. I mean, that is significant. And when you combine the strongly disagree and the disagree, it's like 99%. Again, one stake, this poll has its statistical limitations. But again, I do believe that it's likely indicative of a broader sentiment that other people across the country and the world who are members of the church would feel. Similar numbers for the statement, our stake and ward provides training to leaders about faith crisis. Or my ward leaders know how to effectively minister to individuals in a faith crisis. And just disagree. And so, because so many of these people themselves respond and say, I know people in a faith crisis. I have people in my family, in my extended family, in my ward, right? I know people going through this. These people are basically then also saying, I don't think the church is equipped to deal with this. And I don't know that they're wrong when you look at the low number of percentage of the activity rate of members of the church who are young adults. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up with a story in a scripture. DNC 123. This comes from Liberty Jail, right? Governor Boggs gave his extermination letter. Joseph and others are in jail for months. And over the course of several days in March 1839, Joseph dictates a lengthy letter in a couple parts that later get broken up into DNC 121, 122, and 123. And in here, he's talking, of course, about a lot of the oppression, the trials, the problems that the saints were going through, the challenging circumstances of the world that they were living in. And in verse 1, for example, he says that we would suggest for your consideration the propriety of all the saints gathering up a knowledge of all the facts and sufferings and abuses put upon them. He's making a plea to say we need to create a written record of all these problems. We need to be able to identify as a community who the perpetrators were, who the problems were, when they happened, and what was going on. We need to understand the problems that we're dealing with. So that's how he starts what became DNC 123. And then he goes down below, and there's a few verses that maybe you won't feel that they immediately relate to the topic at hand, but I strongly do, and I'll explain why. Starting in verse 7, Joseph says, it's an imperative duty that we owe to God, to angels with whom we've been brought to stand, and also to ourselves, to our wives and children, who've been made to bow down with grief, sorrow, and care under the most damning hand of murder, tyranny, and oppression. And then he says, that's been urged on and upheld by the influence of that spirit which hath so strongly riveted the creeds of the fathers, who have inherited lies upon the hearts of the children, and filled the world with confusion, and has been growing stronger and stronger, and is now the very mainspring of all corruption, and the whole earth groans under the weight of its iniquity. It's an iron yoke, a strong band, it's handcuffs. Verse 9, therefore, it is an imperative duty that we owe not only to our wives and children, but to the widows, the fatherless, whose husbands and fathers have been murdered under its iron hand, which dark and blackening deeds are enough to make hell itself shudder, and to stand aghast and pale at the hands of the very devil, to tremble in palsy. Okay, here we go. Here's the point, verses 11 and 12. And it is also an imperative duty that we owe to all the rising generation, and to all the pure in heart. For there are many yet on the earth, among all sects, parties, and denominations, who are blinded by the subtle craftiness of men, whereby they lie in wait to deceive, and who are only kept from the truth, because they know not where to find it. We know that verse. We typically use it in just a missionary context of going out and the field is white and ready to harvest. Let's go. People are being kept from the truth because they don't know where to find it. Here I am to help you find it. That's the context that we usually cite that verse in. What I find interesting, though, in at least 3 places, just in the verses I read, it may be elsewhere in the verses I didn't read, he keeps saying that this is an imperative duty that we have. It's an imperative duty for whom? For our wives and children. For our wives and children. He says that at least twice. It's an imperative duty that we owe to the rising generation, this very youth-focused outreach to help them understand the context of the fight that we are in. That it's not just like, oh, shucks, we're just, going to church and going to take the sacrament and going to go to gospel doctrine and then go home and watch a football game, right? That it's not just like plug yourself into the matrix and go through the motions and whatever. that there is this mainspring of all corruption. It's filling the world with confusion. There are bigger stakes at play. And that context is critical so that we understand ourselves, our place before God, what God wants us to do, what our path is. We have to see the bigger picture. It's why I love understanding the premortal realm and the war in heaven and all these things that give our lives context that other Christian religions are completely ignorant to, because they don't have the benefit of that additional scripture that gives some of Isaiah and other biblical scriptures about the premortal realm some better understanding and insight. So this has to be a youth-focused enterprise, and we have to help youth understand what's at stake. We have to help them understand the context of the situation, that the war in heaven has continued on earth, that it's not just about doing, what others are doing and the latest TikTok trend and, whatever's socially acceptable on your woke college campus or whatever. Like, you can't get buffeted about by the winds of political doctrine, because there is so much at stake. We have to document corruption. We have to proclaim truth. We have to waste and wear out our lives in bringing to light the hidden things of darkness. And if we're not talking to our kids about these things, like Joseph is saying 150 years ago or whatever, almost 200 years ago, if we're not documenting these things and talking about them and helping our kids understand the deeper things of our doctrine, then it's all superficial fluff that they feel that they can just like throw off like a sweater that's now out of style, and they don't really have the deeper insight and understanding to know why that they shouldn't throw that off, why it's really necessary for protection and everything. It's an imperative duty, and I feel like too infrequently we are even as adults understanding and discussing these things. And so is it any wonder that our kids, the youth of the church, are being carried away? I mean, don't get me started about, like, there's the whole quote from Vadi Bakum, a Baptist pastor, where he says that, if you send your kids to Caesar's school, can you really be surprised when they return home as Romans? And so Latter-day Saints largely have just delegated the upbringing of their children to the state. Elder Packer had this great quote where he basically says that it's spiritually, what did he say? He said something like it's spiritually dangerous to send your kids to public schools. And many early church leaders warned about this too, and yet we've just given Caesar, the care and upbringing of our kids, and we ourselves as members of the church aren't discussing and focusing on what's really going on here and the horror of all the earth, the great and abominable church, and all these things. And so no wonder that our kids are frankly bored with church. If we're just presenting superficial stuff, I think that's one reason why I struggled, with church. And when I started figuring out some of the deeper things, and I was curious, and I loved kind of chewing on that meat and learning some of that stuff and getting the context, getting the deeper insights that made things start to click. And I'm like, oh, this is what it's about. And I think we have to provide that for our youth appropriately, meet them where they're at. I'm not saying, force a red pill on them and make them unplug immediately, but we have to do, I think, what Joseph is talking about here. It's a slightly different context. I get it. But as I think about that polling data, as I think about the trend of the vast majority of kids who are no longer active in the church, it saddens me, because President Hinckley all the time would talk about how, oh, you're the youth of the noble birthright and the Lord has prepared you and blah, blah, like all the things, right? And it's like, if there's truth in that, and if God has prepared for the last days some of the, righteous spirits to be ready for his return and come and help build Zion, it's not like we need to be shooting for 100%. We're not going to have 100% of young people active. People have agency. A lot of people are going to abandon the straight and narrow. They're going to walk down the wide path and wander. But I think we have to rescue more. And I don't know that we're doing a good job. I don't know that I'm doing a good job as a father of one, soon to be two teenagers, as someone in young men's. I will say it's very difficult to engage young people in these ideas, because we got to make them put their phones away and remove distractions, and they're so like wired for dopamine hits all the time and instant gratification. And I was a rebellious kid. I would ditch Sunday school and go sit in the parking lot with my friend and wait for church to end and listen to what was his name? Regis? Like the top 40 hits of the 90s or whatever. It was during that Sunday hour, he would always, he would have a radio program, and it was always like the the top hits of the week from Regis or whatever. Anyways, so like, kids are going to be kids and whatever, but it's that there's so much more opportunity, and they're so subjected to influence from our society and the culture that we have to help shield them from. And it's an imperative duty. Again and again, Joseph is saying that. And so I am thinking for my own situation as a dad and as a youth leader, how I can fulfill that duty and how we can help the young people of the church so that they have the context, so that they see the big picture, so that it's not just like, yeah, I go to church and I got to do all this checklist stuff. And okay, let's now go to school and let's hang out with friends and be so distracted by the cares of the world that we're drawing close to God with our lips, but our hearts are far from him. We'll wrap it there. See you next Sunday.